Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the panel Politics of the Machine. My name is Daphne Dragon. I'm the curator of this year's conference. So as you might have heard already, this is the second day. Our conference basically this year focuses on the emerging ecologies and hybridities that manifest the relationship of the human and the non-human that in a way is closer than ever before. So we're interested in exploring how media have become environmental and how they are fully integrated into our everyday lives in ways that it's even hard to feel them or understand their existence. And we want to emphasize this condition of new, constant and immediate mediation that often occurs beyond our control. The starting point for this panel was our interest to explore how the immediacy and efficiency of machinic decision-making can influence the politics of the future and examine how open tomorrow's well-regulated worlds might be. So will the increased automation, for instance, take us to a new politics of the machine, and how much room will be allowed for negotiation, opposition, or interference? As a moderator for this session, we are happy to have with us Sharma, who was also our McLuhan speaker for this year. Sarah is the Associate Professor of Media Theory and the newly appointed Director of the McLuhan Center for Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto. She holds her faculty appointment at the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information and Technology, and her graduate appointment at the Faculty of Information at St. George. Sarah is the author of In the Meantime, Temporality and Cultural Politics, published by Duke University Press in 2014, that particularly looked into the speed of life, discussing the relation of time to power and the urge to acknowledge different temporalities. Thanks.
I'm really happy to be here with this motley crew, actually, in front of me. I want to start by saying that the phrase, even, the politics of the machine, sort of presents to us something that seems rather insurmountable. And what are we to do with this, and then discuss this future. So I want to suggest, before we start, I'm going to offer a little framing of a way in which this question might not be so insurmountable. And maybe we can discuss this as well after. It's also knowing the work of the three that sit before me. I recognize these sort of tensions that come up in their work, and some of it will be brought out today as well. One of the first things I want to propose or think about to make this idea of the politics of the machine something we can actually grasp onto and talk about would be to recognize the machinic, which would first allow us to recognize that the politics of the machine is not a new thing. There's always been politics of machines, but what is it new about this contemporary moment? But what are the particular logics of the machines that we're dealing with? So that's one separate question. And also a sense of the machinic allows us to understand that there's a logic, but it's also about our social relationships that happen to be machinic. So we have, I would suggest a machinic politics as another way of thinking about this. The other inescapable, it's almost an inescapable duality when we start talking about the politics of the machine and the future, is one between alienation and agency. And I think people arrive to the question of the politics of the machine or the machinic through one of these two lenses quite often. They're two dominant strands. And we tend to think of them in opposition. So are we talking about agency? Are we talking about alienation? And at what point do we, what's the opening point? But I would, rather than think of these in opposition, maybe we should think of these as tensions. We have different relationships to agency. For some, the question of agency is not even on the table. Other people are more comfortable with a world of limited constraint, therefore alienation is the entry point. So I think we could talk about these two things as tensions and worked out differently into our work. And what does it mean to start with the question of agency, which some of us will, versus alienation, which others will. And the third thing that I want to outline or bring forth is this question of the future also means there's no mythic return. So none of us here will be talking about necessarily an unhindered democracy that we must return to, or an unhindered public that we must return to. But actually instead, I would suggest what comes to the fore with these varied attempts at thinking about the politics of the machine is a necessity for a division of labor across the social field. So there will be different entry points into the question, different conclusions, but this shouldn't lead it to a sense of an insurmountable politics of the machine that we can't get out of, but instead would reflect a division of labor. So we might ask where those various points are in this division of labor and how can we account for them. So I'm going to just leave this there as the slight opening and return to this after we go through our presentations. And we're going to start with Florian. And Florian is going to start with a video too, I believe. But Florian Sprenger is Junior Professor for Media and Cultural Studies at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. He's the author of The Politics of Micro-Decisions, Edward Snowden, Net Neutrality, and the Architectures of the Internet. And he recently edited a special issue of Fiber Culture on computing the city. He publishes on topics such as the Internet of Things, the history of electricity, artificial environments, and media ecology. So with that, we will start with Florian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to the team of Transmediale for having me here. And as you said, I'd like to start my presentation with a short video showing the onboard camera of a Tesla Model X in an accident in the Netherlands just a few weeks ago. Fortunately, no one was hurt in this accident. Perhaps I just show it another time. Well, as I said, no one was hurt, fortunately. In this video, the car calculates the accident between the two cars in front of it before it actually happens, and brakes before the driver is even able to recognize that something is going to happen. In September 2016, 2 months before this accident, Tesla offered Autopilot Update 8.0 for its operating system, including a new radar processing algorithm. Manufactured by Bosch, the radar device installed below the car is also used by other car companies, but Tesla is the first to employ the new feature of interpreting data about the movement of up to 2 cars in front. The radar signal simply bounces between the car and the underground and can thus recognize the next car, even if it is invisible to the driver. You will certainly find similar videos of situations in which self-driving cars prevent accidents on YouTube. And what's so interesting about these videos, at least for me, and I hope that you share this strange fascination, is that they show something we might call computational agency in action. We don't see any computers, just the ordinary street scenes we are familiar with. Nonetheless, there is an uncanny moment when these cars move themselves and react to situations that are about to happen. Taking this fascination as a starting point, I would like to draw your attention to a few observations that seem relevant when we try to understand the impact of such technologies on the current technological condition. The biggest challenge for what we might call smart cars, and I want to circumvent the term self-driving cars, as I will explain in a second, is not only to constantly scan their environment and to map their surroundings, but to make decisions between possible reactions. In this sense, the car has to predict the probabilities of possible futures. As you all know, making street traffic smart necessarily includes a lot of ethical questions. Imagine a situation in which the car has to decide if it rather takes the risk of destroying itself and you as the driver, or of crashing into a group of people, certainly killing some of them. These questions that touch the root of ethical considerations somehow have to be regulated and translated into algorithms. On their basis, the car achieves the power to decide. And I'm going to explain why I think it is important to say that a machine is able to fulfill an act that is traditionally embedded in concepts of intentionality in a second. These acts of decisions are decisions not only between 2 or more alternative chains of reaction, but also between different futures. In order to decide, the car needs alternatives that are in turn products of algorithmic prediction. In this sense, the car combines reactive and proactive agencies and could potentially also include cooperative agencies if it would directly interact with other cars. While the ethical discussions that accompany these developments are focusing on human interaction with the car, I would like to concentrate on the socio-technical dimension of micro-decisions. What we have seen in this video is how this machine algorithm infrastructure network assemblage called car acts below the threshold of both the human sensorium and the response time of human agency. The car, whatever entity that may be, is able to decide in fragments of seconds. Not instantaneous, though, because every decision takes time. I'm not suggesting the autonomy of driving or the assumption that the car can manage all situations while making human drivers useless. That's not what I'm saying, since actually the Tesla is rather a very sophisticated software-based driving assistant with a sensor-based emergency brake and a lane assistant than an autonomous self-driving car. Probably thousands or even millions of calculations have taken place in this short interval before the accident. And though we know that our own nervous system is extremely fast and adaptable, it is obvious that the car's ability to calculate the movements, directions, and speeds of all other cars in its environment, even those invisible to the driver, with the help of radar technologies and a network of sensors, and to calculate the probabilities of different scenarios and possible reactions to them, is not only a question of reaction, but also of prediction. The car predicts what will happen and reacts accordingly. Thus, we witness a strange situation in which prediction and action conjoin to make a decision without a human decider and his agency. This, I want to argue, is more than the operationality of an algorithm and the temporality of radar waves. This whole process constitutes what I want to call micro-decisions. Such decisions are not associated with individual decision makers. Rather, they are effective because they take place automatically in unfathomable numbers and as quickly as possible, according to a fixed set of rules. Political and economic considerations have been made in the background to these micro-decisions. They conflate the levels of the social and the technical. Their protocological and algorithmic regime was determined in negotiation processes between various interest groups, manufacturers, regulators, lawmakers, engineers, and coders, but they are technically implemented by means of binding protocols and algorithms for the sequence of processes. In a technical and mathematical context, a decision, eine Entscheidung, is more than the execution of a predetermined protocol or programmed algorithm, more than the choice of a possible answer. A decision is always an act that draws a distinction. Microdecisions are in no way merely mechanical, determined, and therefore subcomplex processes. As interruptions, there are a fixed component of all communication and transmission in digital networks. And as predictions of possible outcomes, they are bound to the future. The precondition of every microdecision is the interruption of connectivity and its anteriority. The autonomous car is only one, albeit a prominent example of the influence of microdecisions on the present technological outlook. The transmission of data packets at the nodes of a network, high-frequency trading algorithms in their microtemporal rhythm, or the location-based services of smart cities are other examples for their importance. Microdecisions are nothing new or rare. They're happening at each network node for each data packet, which means that each of us is right now involved in thousands of microdecisions. As processes of decision, they are characterized by three attributes. First, they are not bound to human individual decision makers, but they are so powerful because they are automated and following an algorithmic or protocological regime. Their effectiveness derives precisely from their automation, their sheer number, and their speed, all of which surpass human understanding because of their involvement at every second in the operation of, for example, a smart car or the transmission of a bit packet. Second, their sheer number can only be accomplished by computers. Their quantity is their quality. And third, their temporality undermines our own thresholds of perception because they obey to the tact of digital processing. In this sense, they represent the smallest unit and the technical precondition of a present-day network politics and of our potential opposition to it. Microdecisions decide upon possibilities that shape life in digital cultures. Who can move where and who can't, who has access and who has no access, who is connected and who is disconnected, probably also who is a potential victim of an accident and who is not. Nonetheless, microdecisions are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. For the operations of a digital network, such as that of car traffic or of data packets, however, they are unavoidable. That means that we need a conceptual framework that helps us to understand their mode of power in its socio-technical dimension. All three aspects that I mentioned show the challenges for a theory of microdecisions, because it questions traditional concepts of agency, because the act of deciding has to be separated from individual deciders. Consequently, we should establish a vocabulary to understand their consequences, explore their media archaeology and genealogy, and investigate their spatial and temporal dimension. Such microdecisions do not take place in parliaments, political hotspots, or police stations, but rather in data centers, central processing units, or server farms at the level of technical infrastructures. All decisions regarding further actions are thus tied to specific preconditions in space and time. They are part of infrastructures. Along their way through these infrastructures, every bit packet crosses numerous nodes where, in the short amount of time required by temporary storage and buffer, a series of microdecisions is made by means of established protocols. In the case of digital networks, a decision about the most efficient path to the destination, a decision about the processing speed, a decision about the priority of the incoming packets. These microdecisions interrupt the stream of data in order to control its distribution. The stream, in this sense, never flows uninterruptedly. In this sense, I will argue that they are exactly not immediate, as the outline of this panel suggests. The fact that transmissions are constantly interrupted not only means that they are never completed in putative real time, that people are never connected immediately, and that we have no direct access to the world we are connected to. Interruptions are also the precondition for decisions. Decisions require time, whether they are human or machinic. In order to map out the extent of these decisions, it is necessary to know when, where, how, and why transmissions have been interrupted, instead of simply dismissing interruptions as a temporary setback to the success of communication. This is also the reason why simply assuming the determination of decisions by machines results in a simplistic division between determined machinic agency and free human agency. The concept of microdecisions wants to circumvent such shortcomings by taking into account three aspects. First, conceptualizing microdecisions as predetermined acts of rendering a pre-programmed set of rules would also mean that such decisions cannot be changed and are bound to past events instead of anticipating and regulating the future. While it is obvious that human agency and human decision-making are different from machinic agency, that does not mean that we should imagine agency only as a blueprint of human agency against which mechanistic or machinic agency would seem to be deterministic. Second, if we define microdecisions as determined, we would not be able to understand the technological developments that allow, for example, a smart car to react to the complexity of its environment. Seeing decisions as deterministic would imply that they are immediate. The fact that microdecisions and that no transmission and no medium can ever be immediate, that they always take time, leads to a non-deterministic, decisive understanding of microdecisions. This means, thirdly, that the politics of microdecisions, including potentials to transform them, are based upon the interruption of connection and the fact of constant disconnection. To speak about decisions and to borrow this concept from social theory does not yet entail that there is any social intention behind their procedure. The machines that carry out the decisions are of course produced and managed by people who also determine and program their protocols and algorithms. Even the measures according to which decisions are made are necessarily established in protracted institutional negotiations, obvious in the ethical discussions about the implementation of reactions in smart cars. Yet the great mass of microdecisions can only be executed by computers, and it is this mass that underlies the technical definition of success of digital communication or traffic on computer-supported networks. Microdecisions have become as effective as they are precisely because they circumvent the laborious human act of what could be called decision-making. Thus, instead of speaking about the technical determination of social processes or the precedence of social intentions before technical processes, the perspective followed here calls for a sort of procedural escalation, on one that plays back and forth between automated execution and political interests, between the technical and the social. However important they might be to understanding digital cultures, descriptions of algorithms and protocols alone have not elucidated acts of decision-making so far, Such acts entail their own sorts of politics and are not congruent with the commissions that establish protocols or the computers that fulfill them. A power analysis of present digital cultures should therefore operate in terms of technical infrastructures, their reconfigurations of the social, and thus without drawing a line between human and technical actors. These observations have a series of consequences for network politics of interruption and for a opposition against the decisions in question. As it is, the decision-making process cannot be denied. To do so would be to deny the very thing about which decisions are being made, the transmission of data in digital networks. That decisions are made cannot be treated as a matter of negotiation. To do this would be to dismantle the foundation of the very object under negotiation. In this situation, it is difficult to adapt an unambiguous position. I think it would be misleading to try to take these decisions back into our hands again. This fight, if it was ever fought, has long been lost. We cannot return to a world without such micro-decisions. What we can do, nonetheless, is try to open the imaginary of these decisions. That means to foster different futures. What we witness is a transformation of possibilities into potentialities and of contingency into calculation. To speak about decisions also means to bear in mind that no decision is ineluctable and that every decision can be reached in a different manner. That it is possible to modify them for the better, but that they can also turn out for the worse. Yet even a bad decision is better than no decision, which leaves no room for improvement. To make decisions in advance, to determine them, or even to abolish the act of decision-making is, in every case, to reduce what is possible. In the sense, politics of contemporary machines thus ought to begin at the level of micro-decisions and at the places and times of decision-making. As interruptions, they are central to understanding the structure of networks. They have locations because they are nodes in the network or the infrastructure that break up direct connections, and they are temporal because time is what interruptions require. Always more than one would like, and yet this duration is a precondition for the network's very possibility. An alternative network politics can organize itself around these interruptions, delays, and differences. Beyond looking for exploits, which a few years ago Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker have defined as vulnerabilities within systems of power that are capable of being modulated, an alternative network politics should not only make interruption its mode of operation, but should also understand interruption as communication and disconnection as connection. To finally come back to my example of the self-driving car, the uncanny that may creep upon us while watching this video is a symptom for the necessity to rethink our relation to such technologies. Not only regarding the fact that the truck driver is the most common job in more than half of the states of the US today, and that many of these jobs will be handed over to machines probably soon. While car companies are, as I mentioned, not yet able to present the fully automated car that replaces the driver in everyday situations, we still witness, as I tried to show, the power of micro-decisions. The scale of their agency is not a conscious human being, but the sheer number of decisions. What we witness and should try to map are, in other words, first, a new mode of power, second, a mechanism that employs and connects machines with machines, and third, the socio-technical conditions of digital cultures. Perhaps, however, an even greater challenge is looming ahead, because micro-decisions are made by machines both for and about other machines. Although we might still be able to identify individual decisions, we will always be too late to the scene, because their sheer number and speed exceeds our capacities. If machines act only with machines, and people are mere accessories at the end of the nodes, if the interests of power continue to be served by newer and ever more precise machines, and if decisions have no longer decision makers, then the actual task before us might shift. It could then be the case that our traditional description languages, our concepts of human and machines, of creation, work, and activity, will all have become too imprecise to comprehend what is happening and who is supervising whom. Perhaps our concepts are no longer sufficient for understanding machines that neither render human beings superfluous nor were designed according to our model. Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to, I think, the dark side of finance, some more good news from Brett Scott. Brett Scott is a journalist, campaigner, and the author of The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. He works on financial reform, alternative finance, and economic activism with a wide variety of NGOs, artists, students, and startups, and he writes for such publications as The Guardian, New Scientist, Wired Magazine, and CNN.com. He produced the 2016 UN RISD report on blockchain technology and is a fellow of the Finance Innovation Lab, an associate at the Institute of Social Banking, and an advisory group member of the Brixton Pound. He helps facilitate a course on power and design at the University of the Arts London and facilitates workshops on alternative finance with the London School of Financial Arts.
Cool, thank you. Hello. Today I'm supposed to speak about either digital finance or blockchain technology. I might get to blockchain technology, but probably not. I have this quite chaotic flow diagram of points I'm supposed to get through. And there are about 15 points, and I have 15 minutes, so I'll probably get like halfway through. When people are thinking about, I was thinking about the politics of the financial machines, or the financial machine. And when people think about financial machines, I suspect, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I suspect the first thing people imagine is like high-frequency trading. They're imagining these like automated trading algorithms. And actually, interestingly, artists really love high-frequency trading. I know a lot of artists who do these sort of conceptual artworks around, I don't know, playing with automated trading algorithms. Now, interestingly, high-frequency trading, I wouldn't really class as a form of automation of finance. It's automation of trading. The actual trading itself is not particularly fundamental or even inherent to finance itself. Trading is a process of buying and selling things. You can trade avocados or cars, or you can trade financial instruments. So interestingly, in the case of something like high-frequency trading, often the underlying things that are being traded are actually created manually. I used to work in the financial sector. Tons of the world of investment banking and high finance takes place over phones with people talking to each other. Manually written contracts. Okay, so the case of something like high-frequency trading, you're really talking about the automation of the trading of manually produced financial instruments. And actually, a large part of investment banking is actually like that. The more sort of profound realm of automation of finance is actually in more boring finance, a sort of everyday finance, which we might call retail finance. And to kind of go into this, I was thinking you kind of need to, I don't know how well you guys like understand finance stuff. I mean, I don't necessarily claim to always understand finance, but I mean, the basic gist of finance is the process of writing contracts. That's very important. It's a contractual realm. Writing contracts about the future in order to mobilize human activity in the present. Okay, that's a very generalized description. More specifically, it's the process of writing contracts about future money in order to obtain present money via which you can then mobilize human action. So to give the example of, for example, property development, what's happening? A contract is written to shareholders saying, if you give us money now, we'll give you money in the future, right? We'll then take that money, we'll go into a labor market and a goods market, and we'll hire laborers, and we will also buy goods of various sorts. We will build a building, we will then go into the rental market, and we'll sell access to the building, and then we'll pay you in the future from that rental income. Okay, so you're basically creating these circuits via which you mobilize human labor. And it only works insofar as money works. So the whole sort of substrate of finance is money, and you have to make sure that money itself is fused into human labor, such that people will actually do things with their bodies when you offer them money. Okay, and in that situation, if you can get money fused into human labor, the process of manipulating monetary flows, you can basically steer the energy of people in various ways. Okay, I don't know how clear that is. Basically, though, finance is a realm of contracts. But the normal way we often think about contracts is we tend to think about them as being between equals of some sort. And in reality, very few people experience the financial sector like that. We tend to almost imagine it as this kind of service that's given to you by large institutions. And in reality, the structure of the financial sector is such that you have very large, powerful players who are specialized in arranging these contracts, and then ordinary people who go in and sort of ask for permission to enter into these contracts with these players. Okay, so that's sort of two sides of the financial equation, as were the financial sector and then the ordinary public. Now, there's a whole bunch of ethics within this, which I might not go into now. We can discuss the process of financing is highly political. You're creating stuff whilst you're simultaneously destroying stuff. There's processes of labor exploitation, and there's tons of ethical issues. And the financial sector has a whole body of ideology and processes of thinking how to neutralize these sort of ethical dimensions. And the actual structure of financial institutions themselves also helps in this process. Whereby financial professionals are often able to imagine themselves as not being responsible for the outcomes of their actions. Okay, that was finance. Sort of, I mean, that's a very broad. All right, and once you create those financial instruments, you can then trade them. Okay, so that's where all the high-frequency trading stuff comes in. Okay, but now let's start think about that process I just described. What elements of those can be automated? And because this is the realm of what we call digital finance, where the sort of machinic finance elements start to come in. All right, there's two elements that you can automate. You can either automate the jobs of the financial sector professionals, the process of making decisions about these, or the process of just constructing the contracts and making decisions whether to offer them to people. All right, that's the one realm of digital finance. A second realm of digital finance is essentially the realm of automating the user experience layer for the ordinary customer. Okay, so and those often sometimes go together, but you can imagine hypothetically a completely non-automated process of deciding on whether to offer financial contracts, and then an automated user experience layer by which you access that. And what's called the financial technology sector in London, for example, often fixates upon building these new user experience layers to place over the core of the financial sector, as it were. So it's like, rather than walking into a branch, I'm going to interact with the system via my mobile phone, for example. That's just a layer you're placing over the underlying processes. And there's a ton of interesting ethical questions you can ask about the placing of these user experience layers. Whether, for example, right now in the financial sector, people already have an incredibly disconnected way of perceiving it. When you're entering into these financial contracts, there's a whole bunch of ways you sort of touch the surface of finance, as it were. You sort of, I don't know, in your own lives, how do you touch the financial sector? You go into a branch, you interact with this person there, or you go to an ATM and this kind of interface. Or you go into your internet banking interface, and these kind of like portals that sort of allow you to touch it. And then there's a whole body of sort of financial imagery and all this mythology around what's supposedly happening behind that. And these are how ordinary people often sort of touch the financial sector, and people are often incredibly unaware of actually what's going on behind there, which means financial professionals themselves can engage in many activities without getting any kind of oversight from the people that they are technically serving. Now, one of the questions that's emerging, I don't have an answer for it, is whether these sort of creation of these user experience layers, these automated user experience layers, for example, with digital banking of various sorts, either accentuate the process of disconnection, so increasing alienation from the process of finance, or whether you can actually use them to somehow give people a better sense of what's actually occurring in the sector. So that's one realm of, I guess, research to look into. In the realm of the financial professionals themselves, though, there's a whole sort of trajectory that's occurred by the automation of financial jobs. Now, in finance, there's always been the use of tools. From like ancient finance, you get the use of abacuses and all this kind of stuff to how you basically will calculate financial flows. But moving forward, there's been the creation of financial machines. Have you guys ever thought about what a financial machine is? If you think about what a machine is, generally it's the automation of a tool of some sort using non-human energy, so fossil fuels of some sort. And in the realm of finance is the creation of contracts, so it's often hard to think about what is a financial machine exactly. And really it's the process of how do you automate the calculation processes. So the Excel spreadsheet's a pretty good example of a financial machine. A large part of what financial professionals do if they were manually calculating, it would take many, many days. Whereas these new sort of models that they use can calculate financial contracts very, very quickly. So that's an example of a financial machine. If you then attach that machine to some kind of executive power, you start to develop financial robots. So if you give that Excel spreadsheet the ability to act upon inputs that are coming in and to produce outputs that create some kind of action, you're creating a kind of a robotic system. So there's plenty of examples of robot systems right now. And then I guess the frontier that's emerging, like in any sector, is the realm of AI, which is basically like create a slightly more advanced robotic system which can have some kind of predictive capacities. And key to that is basically you've got to churn tons of data through the system to calibrate your models. And this is a very exciting realm for all sorts of people who are into that. How much time do I have, by the way? I have time. Okay. You know, I was actually recently in Singapore at this IMF thing there, and you know, everyone was wetting themselves with excitement because they discovered that with the use of mobile phones, you can start to trace people's movements. You start to have a lot more data inputs that are coming in, and with this, you could start to calculate how creditworthy a person was depending on where they were moving. All right, so if you're dealing with people who've got quite low income, you could say if they're repeatedly moving from one place in the morning to somewhere else in the afternoon, or during the morning and then coming back, it suggests they've got some kind of stable job. Okay, and from this we can start to work out that potentially they are creditworthy. So like one of these, so there's this realm of working out creditworthiness is a massive area of machine learning in finance, and it always has been, and it's getting more and more advanced. I'm trying to think about, you know, what kind of like new data inputs can we create to actually try and work out how likely people are to honor their financial contracts. Of course, like any sector that has these processes going on, it starts to develop all these kind of Kafkaesque elements. So people start to be told certain things about whether they can get a loan or not, but there's nobody who can explain to them why the system's decided that. Okay, because in your old models, the financial professionals would actually be able to give an account for it, about why they had made that decision or why the model that they had programmed could do it. But with increasingly advanced models, the actual programmers themselves don't know why the machines made the decision. So you start to have this kind of, you find yourself categorized in some category, and you can't get any form of accountability. But this is not unique to finance. There's many sectors that have this type of strange Kafkaesque element emerging. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water. Are you guys coping with this? Oh God. Okay. So to reiterate, this is like the automation of the processes of financial professionals making decisions. Then there's a separate part of how do you present it to people, or how do you let them interface with that, which is the sort of user experience design stuff. Now, one of the slightly interesting things, actually Warwick University is starting quite a new interesting research program on the politics of financial interfaces with financial apps. On the one hand, you've got this whole thing which you find with any interface design, which is the person who controls the menu controls the thought space, as it were, like what your imagined realm of possibilities are. So you can start to have these very interesting, I mean, I don't know what the outcomes of this will be, but this whole idea how you can actually sort of mold people's expectations of what kind of rights and obligations they have. And there's a whole interesting thing where behavioral economics was often used to design these interfaces around around finance that will now actually feed back into how to convey this point. You design these user interfaces with behavioral economics in mind and then present them back to people. So you start to have the circularity emerging in economic interactions where you're trying to basically steer people into this behavior that you've previously studied as a scientific discipline. So that's what Warwick's starting to look at is, will you find these weird sort of circular patterns emerging that will actually mess up economic theory, as it were? I'm going to quickly jump to a new section before I've got like 2 minutes. One thing I haven't talked about is payment systems. Okay, now you might want to separate out this process I've been talking about of people creating financial contracts with the automation of payment systems, which is something else that banks do. And I don't have time to go into this, but this will be a very, very important area, especially in the context of IoT and many other areas. in the past, when we've been talking about automation, what we primarily have often referred to is the automation of production of some sort. So what I've just been talking about is the automation of the production of financial contracts. Okay. What we haven't really yet seen that much is the automation of the process of exchange. Okay, we've always assumed there's some kind of moment whereby when you engage in an exchange, there's some kind of thought process going on, even if all the stuff that you're exchanging has been automated in terms of its production. The big kind of like area now of innovation is people trying to fuse in automated payment systems with IoT. And this is, we don't know what the outcomes of this will be, and it's quite interesting for economic theory itself, because economic theory often presumes that what's going on is people are engaging in rational decision-making processes within markets. Whereas this new form of automated exchange actually potentially challenges that. And I'm going to end this now because I've probably gone on too long. Sorry about that.
So maybe we'll understand why I'm suggesting there could be something hopeful in alienation, and we're going to move there with Patricia Reed. Patricia Reed is an artist, writer, and designer based in Berlin. Exhibitions have included those at the Museum of Capitalism, the CUAG, South Kiosk, Homework 7, here actually as well, Odeon Gallery and 0047, amongst others. As a writer, she has contributed to books and periodicals, including Reinventing Horizons, the DX Machina, Crossbenching, #Accelerate, The Accelerationist Reader, The Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism, Intangible Economies and Cognitive Architecture. Reed is a board member of the New Center for Research and Practice, and she's also a member of Laboria Cryonics and the Office for the Implied Complexity Working Groups. I will say I skipped over some of the German things I couldn't pronounce. And with that, I will say, because I skipped over some of these important things, that I wanted to point out that Patricia was part of the xenofeminist, I don't think we'll call it a manifesto, but the xenofeminism collective, which made significant waves and rounds. And with that, here we are.
Sure, thanks a lot. And thanks so much for these great presentations. And it's so strange, Sarah, I swear there's like some super weird telepathy we've never met. And like literally the first line of my super boring pre-prepared talk, because I'm really not spontaneous, is we have to think the title Politics of the Machine recursively, so I'd like to suggest Machinic politics. And it's like here with empirical proof. So in light of the overall, so to think kind of tagging along with Sarah and hopefully like closing the loop a little bit, because I tend to speak in a bit more generic kind of gloss. So hopefully that could start to maybe create some connections between what we've just heard, which is like quite specific with like case study examples and so on. So in light of the overall ambitions of Ever Elusive that we're kind of contributing to and participating in over the course of the festival, that seeks to locate sites and our gestures of agency in today's techno-reality, one generic site that I would like to highlight in this brief talk is kind of like what Brett was saying before, this kind of interfacial space of human-machinic coupling where generative recursion can manifest. So, and I guess now in light of Florian's talk, we should probably expand that already into not just the human and the machinic coupling, but the machine to the machine coupling as well. So the call to focus on this abstract site of mediation assumes two things. So first, that we humans mold technology that molds us ad infinitum, and this of course is for better or worse. So this is basically media theory 101. And secondly, in a historical moment where the capacity for making things public has never been more available, although of course not equally distributed or ubiquitous, theories of political subjectivation exclusively privileging sheer visibility, audibility, sensibility, do not adequately take into account the functioning and value creation mechanisms of either communicative capitalism, so this is the exploitation of communication as a circulating force. This has been outlined by Jody Dean a few years ago. Or platform capitalism, which is a monopoly leveraging data extraction business model, and this has been more recently outlined by the theorist Nick Cernicek. Sheer communicative multiplication and visibility do not transform these techno-capitalist imperatives, despite the potential contents of communication. So while sometimes being helpful in bringing people together, they alone, I think it's becoming obvious, are not enough. It's because of this scenario that a powerful site, and I use site maybe in Anführungszeichen here, for the transformative political claims lies at the interfacial layer. And here I'm kind of meaning a little bit more the abstract space of spaces of cognition, where bidirectional operations are unleashed, new perspectives can be forged, and new relationships instantiated. So I'll be elaborating on that last point in a little bit. Although we're sitting in a forum focusing on the latest in high-tech possibilities and their political consequences, it seems urgent to point out the importance of the most basic technology we all possess, namely the ability to wield and be seized by concepts. Machines are constructed under certain conceptual nomoi, so this would be the precondition of naturalized assumptions. They are embedded within what Foucault calls episteme, which are the constraints on the conditions of possibility for all knowledge creation in a given historical period, whether implicitly or explicitly. So these epistemic constraints are kind of like baked into the technology, making it impossible to speak of any emancipatory capacity for machinic politics without transforming these conceptual biases, where many of these discriminatory procedures have been made entirely explicit because of the way machines display how they see or don't see, for example, people of color, how they hear accents, or how they even judge beauty. So on a side note, if there's to be any egalitarianism baked into the development of AI or AGI, we critically need to reverse learn from the machines and come to terms with the biases explicitly reflected back at us. Because technology is always infused by the social conditions of its making, the promise of a machinic politics in the service of the many isn't something to be only done out there through technological innovation or as a type of tool-based externality, but is equally bound to processes of self-transformation as a retooling of human self-conception. This procedure unfolds as a trialectics between ideality, or concepts, materiality, or gestures of techno-instantiation, and reality, or inscription. Any ambitious claim for an emancipatory politics proportionate to the risks and potentialities of our given historical condition cannot be conceived without a corresponding concept of what we are, and perhaps more importantly, where we stand as humans within reality. And this is what I'd like to call our generic situatedness. This is probably familiar to most transmediale diehards. The diagram of the stack, so this is of course plotted by Benjamin Bratton, provides a useful scaffold from which to conceptualize such representational situatedness. Now I use this not because it's a kind of exhaustive account of reality, but because of its focus on the consequences of planetary scaled computation. The stack, as you see here, is composed of many different species of machines, from energy grids to universal addressing systems to nation-state geopolitical borders, operating through a nexus of hardware and software. So as a concise explanatory model, the stack, I guess this is more what you see, not the crazy different things incorporated by the stack, but the stack consists of 6 layers. So we have the user, followed by the interface, address, city, cloud, and earth layers, and it appears in this hierarchical ordering. So important for the discussion here is that Bratton's stack foreshadows, and he kind of even incites, he welcomes it, what he calls a Copernican trauma, wherein the human's position within the megastructure is no longer the radiant center of activity, and moreover, where the human can no longer claim a monopoly on the faculty of intelligence, as artificial general intelligence stands to diversify what intelligence even means and what it can do, not to mention how we will eventually couple with it or not. So although in such a mega-systemic account, it appears as if the aptitudes of the human are dramatically diminished or made negligible, it must be stated that capacities are not reduced because of this decentered, non-radiant conception of the human, again in the generic, but that this positional remapping is a necessary concept in order to reorient our perspectives and therefore our capacities, so what we can do, in substantive and artificial egalitarian ways, since of course nature itself is brutally never egalitarian. So the scalar model of the stack follows implicit cues from an earlier philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars, who had made it his philosophical project to tackle complexity before in fact it was a named science, of how, in his words, things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term, end quote. Forming, of course, in the end, the semblance of a continuous world. This provides us, as Ray Brassey notes, with a vision that ought to, quote, not only encompass, but also to explain the intrication of conceptual ideality and physical reality, end quote. Now, while distinctions between things are made, they do not fall into mere dualisms, since it is precisely the labor of philosophy in Sellars' account to integrate, that is, to articulate the connections or continuums between those distinctions. Just as in the stack, where the focus is not on discrete layers, but also on their interactions and relations. So the stack, I think, importantly, forces us to confront two important points simultaneously. So first, it is to integrate this Copernican trauma, so a question of human self-image. And second, it requires that we achieve some sort of cognitive traction on its objecthood in order to create a mental diagram of planetary computational reality today. Now, it's because of this double demand impelled by the stack that the distinction proffered by Sellars between what he calls the manifest image, so this is how we see ourselves as human subjects in the world, and the scientific image, how we know ourselves as physical things in the world, seems really instructive here. So the task, to reiterate this point, lies not in maintaining that polarity, rather in constructing a perspectival stereoscopy between these two modes. Modes, furthermore, that fruitfully contaminate one another in potentially transformative ways. So where, of course, a mutated self-understanding will open up new territories for collective politicization and instrument building, which then feed forward into novel self-understanding and so forth. So the modeling of our self-conception requires a collective subjectivity predicated not on atomized individuality, but on a common conceptual openness. For the manifest image is a product of an aggregated human pursuit, belonging to no one in particular, but to everyone in general, a kind of cousin of sorts to the general intellect. Rather than thinking this openness as a sort of mimicry of the kind of openness at work within a subsuming capitalist nomos, where openness simply equates with the opportunities associated with infinite economic expansion, that is in fact strictly infidelity to a closed logic from within, and lessly not open at all. No, the transformative force of the self-image remodeling is driven by an openness to a conceptual non-given, an immanent openness that is activated by the outside. The philosopher Reza Negarestani names this as radical openness. An openness that cannot be compelled by the triumph of human will, but an openness that can only operate through the seduction of the outside and learning how to become better targets for its force. Essentially, what this self-transformation entails is an openness built on our collective ability to become prey to the foreign non-givenness of reality, to contingent xeno-concepts, and our capacity to be conceptually available to them and grasped by them. Such an image of self-transformation defies the neoliberalist imperatives for individualism, which feeds directly into further economic commands for self-realization in the name of competitive advantage. With radical openness as a collective labor in becoming prey to the foreign, it is what we can call an alien subjectivity, with much sympathy, of course, to recent texts from Antonia Maiazza and Luciana Parisa, who have also called for an alien becoming. So this is a subjectivity not only responsive to our plastic, social, constructed techno-reality for us, but also to the reality that is utterly indifferent and many times invariant to us. So in the minimum instance, we can say that the engineering of stereoscopy, this sort of bidirectional functioning of concepts, is dependent on our capacity for an alien subjectivation, requiring a labor of integrative mediation. How can we become better prey to xeno or foreign concepts, to the non-given, an alienness that often cannot be apprehended by unaided perceptual faculties alone, but that requires, nonetheless, thinkability. It demands a degree of cognitive or affective access. So the short answer is the interface. The interface is a mediating tool for the seduction of the outside. It affords us the capacity for alien subjectivation. No doubt human-machinic and machinic-machinic coupling will play a huge role here. In an era where politics, wholly trapped in an anthropocentric chauvinism, is no longer sufficient to the abstract, planetary scale demands we face, the interface, beyond its limited signification in the realms of pure visuality or screen design in software applications, offers a gateway to this complexity that requires a manner of cognitive and activity-based condensation. The power of the interface is that it can both simplify complexity in a non-trivial way, offering reasoned accessibility to otherwise inaccessible objects and processes, while it simultaneously mediates functions, translations, and produces effects, as Alexander Galloway has famously made clear, through this design filtration system. It's in this expanded generic description of the interface where its alignment with perspectivalism comes into sharp congruency, and precisely why the argument for alien subjectivation finds pragmatic agency in this labor for mediation. It is what affords, we can call the abduction of ourselves, as Robin McKay has called it, by the outside to what is not yet given and what is epistemically mobile or even hypothetical. So if the design of technology is always a mirroring or extension of our particular predispositions, nomoi, and biases, it follows then that the fashioning of emancipatory geopolitical schemata urged on by things like the stack and its attendant machinic politics can only be conceived in parallel with a renovation of our generic self-understanding that justly faces up to our existing biases. Models, as the philosopher Margaret Morrison notes, generate perspective, giving rise to possibilities for intervening in the world, which is why a model for actionable subjectivity itself demands a similar renewal. To overcome the complexity fatigue plaguing our given political moment, we must learn to be grasped by this Copernican blow, and in turn, learn how to grasp the new perspectives this resituated positioning opens up, how it remaps the constitution of what we could call we-ness, affording new gestures, actions, actors, and sites for a hopefully synthetic politics to emerge. So thanks.
Okay, before we move to audience questions, I wanted to give you all an opportunity still to talk to each other if you wanted to. If you wanted to.
Well, I think there was one thing that all three lectures had in common, which was kind of opposition to this tendency of what in German can be called Dekontingenzierung, perhaps the unbecoming or unmaking of contingency. I think the openness that you described is a way of making things contingent again, or I don't know if again, but making things contingent. And you said that finance is about contracts. Contracts are in a way kind of making things not contingent. And when I stood you right, you're in a way also opposing this kind of decontingenzation, or however it is called in English. So I think that this contingency might be one of the things that we see in current media cultures today.
Would you think like just to provide a good translation for decontingence, I can't even say it. Would you just say determinism?
I wouldn't say that determinism and contingency are the same.
And decontingency?
Yeah, they're related.
Okay.
But I think the contingency is on a different level than determinism, or the opposite of contingency. Contingency is on a different level than determinism.
Okay. But like maybe, I mean, can I be a bit bold? And because there's some linkages that I would like to explore between Sarah's work and Brett's work, because I know you work a lot on time. And I'm not a scholar of your work, so apologies for the rather naive question. But one thing that seems that I know a lot of the work that I do with my colleagues in Laboria Cubonics is is kind of related to this time thing. And the thing that derivatives, for example, make explicit is that the future is actionable in the present. And you are working on time with kind of different strands of labor, how different temporalities, how people are in the service of people of different temporalities. But I'm wondering if we're speaking about, because I see a lot of potential in the way the temporality, I'm not like pro-finance, but I'm very curious about the temporal structure this unleashes and the possibilities for that and how that could be politically actionable. But then I'm wondering how this ties into your own research, which, as I understood it, is in some parts even a little bit anthropological with interviews and so on, and maybe there's an interesting temporal link to build between your work.
Well, I'll say a few things. Having read Brett's work as well, I think one of the things that's interesting is Brett, I find that you talk about this at different levels also, like somebody arriving to the machine and watching people interact with the ATM versus larger structures. So I already see this, like there's various temporalities in that sort of relationship to finance, which is also, I think there's some vivid descriptions in some of your work about like watching somebody not know what to do with the machine, which is one way of being alienated from this whole process versus the sort of economic anxiety everybody feels anyway. So I think there's multi-layers, whether or not you call them multi-layers or multi-temporalities. I've noticed that in your own understanding.
Yeah, sure. I have nothing particularly profound to say. I don't think digital finance or automation of finance really affects the sort of time element per se of finance. I'm not sure that was what you were getting at. Bear in mind that the financial sector is locked into the broader economic system. You could imagine the financial sector as sort of some of the conduits via which the rewards from economic production are steered. And that's a process that takes place over time. So there's, by default, there's all these, and there's, so the financial sector is the creation of circuits that get resolved all the time. So every single time you guys are buying a product, you're basically resolving a circuit it was set in motion like potentially years ago. And that was facilitated by finance, because the end. When I'm buying, for example, a coffee at the store at the cafe here, there was a process of production that was I don't even know when it began. Probably like 2 years ago, potentially, maybe longer, right? And for it to get it to this point, you have to have the financial sector facilitating that. Derivatives. I used to work with derivatives. I'm not really sure. Well, we could go into that, but. The automation of finance, I don't think really affects the time-based element of it, if I'm understanding it correctly. Maybe I'm misinterpreting.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily speaking about the automation of it. I just meant the whole way the derivative has been theorized, and for sure you have probably more like concrete experience. I'm the book person, but when I think about how Elena Esposito has described, who's a systems theorist, so like time is a huge thing for Luminian systems theorists. So she was basically saying that with the derivative thing as a kind of object, it dramatically rewrites our conception of time, right? Because when we would have this phenomenological experience of time, like a moment happens in this kind of linear way and we proceed to the future, that it's actually the future that's like more active on the present because of this, let's say, innovation or technology of the derivative. And yeah, so she's written
for finance
on
more generally, rather than not just derivatives.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a standard thing. It basically, it's called discounting. When you're trying to bring the concept of the future into the present. But yes, I'll explore that. Thank you.
And now we'll take questions from the audience. There's a microphone on the side over there.
In this discussion of sort of effect of derivatives or of future prediction on the present, it sort of comes to mind that we've talked a lot about this, in a way, how that makes, you're making an active choice, or the machine is making an active choice for us, which of our potential futures that it is able to perceive is the most valuable or correct. In that way, the machines are imposing their own value systems, which may or may not have been created by particular or very complex systemic actors to influence that value system on the present. But we haven't said very much about whether or not those value systems are, inherently political, leftist, rightist, elitist, classist, sort of whatever else. And, Patricia, we were talking about how we, at some point, can see those systemic biases reflected in the data sets that we see collected back by these large machine systems. And then that gives us the possibility to then push, the way we influence those systems in certain directions. I guess my question is, how do we move towards perhaps a more radical machinist politics that accepts the influence of those systems? Is our goal as, say, like a political radical activist to perform direct action that pollutes data sets and pushes them in ways that suggest possible futures in, more radical or intended desire ways that, are more inclusive or have some other political ends?
I wouldn't say that the machines determine these value systems, or the value systems that are happening are machinic, because they are, as you said, they're objects of political negotiations. And for example, in the smart cars, there are huge discussions. Of course, the car manufacturers have different positions than lawmakers or lawyers or whoever. So I think on this level, there isn't much importance of the machine. What is important for the machine is, I think, that in the act of decisions, when you only look at the process of how these kind of rules or of regulations were made, then you don't come to the point that in the act of decision there's an interruption, and in this interruption there are different futures that are possible. And I think that this is the important point where kind of resistance can take place. It's not only in the discussion of all this framework, which is important, of course, and which is a matter of politics, of human politics. But when you look at the machine, then it's this different layer of the interruption that I think is important.
The stuff around data pollution is interesting because I had this concept of algo-robotic systems, which is just like, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but it's just a concept I made up for myself when I was thinking about finance stuff. And it applies to many other systems right now, which is basically that if you conceptualize a robot as essentially sensors with a mind and a body, an algorithmic mind and a machinic body of some sort, or a mechanical assemblage that then takes in sense data and processes it through an algorithm to then move some kind of mechanical parts. That's some kind of like old school idea of robots, right? But now you're seeing all those functions split out. So you're seeing these networks of sensors, then you're seeing sort of data hubs that process that via the algorithmic systems that then send orders out to this kind of assemblage of body parts. So you can imagine Uber like that. It's a kind of a robotic system. And the original sensors are the mobile phones, then it goes to a processing, and then it basically spits out an outcome. And of course, that opens up a bunch of possibilities for data activism, right? You can start to warp those data, the process of the inputs. I've asked some people on the data politics side. I haven't seen any like really examples of this, but it could be an interesting thing to investigate. On the other hand, you're just going to see the rise of stuff like data terrorism, where you can basically manipulate these machines to do things which they weren't intended to do. Somebody quite well known was talking about this recently. So that's definitely something. These kind of feedback effects, once people become aware they're part of these systems. The other thing I was going to say on the politics of this, I mean, I was thinking about like YouTube recommendation systems, which are essentially, I mean, imagining some kind of machine learning system, and the conceptualization of what a recommendation means in these systems, which is basically show something to somebody that they've already displayed some kind of behavior, they've left a data trail, then like show them something, which corresponds to that, and it's very much equivalent to like giving a drunk person more booze. That's the basic moral structure of how they're designed. It's like work out something about some previous behavior and then accentuate it in some kind of sense, and that's actually a moral choice on the part of programmers. And I think these systems need to think about what does real recommendation actually mean in society. That's actually a political choice you're making. You can't just say the machine has come to some kind of objective understanding of the person and will now try to accentuate that same thing. So yeah.
In response to Florian's talk about value systems of machines, especially of them becoming entities by which can make decisions, they have the capability of, surpassing human intelligence, saying who has access and who doesn't have access. In terms of supervision as well, I was wondering what your opinions are about what it would mean about democratic procedures. Or not so democratic procedures considering the circumstances today?
Well, yes, indeed. These procedures are not very democratic at the moment. And of course, NSA surveillance and surveillance of all kinds is happening exactly at these points in the act of micro-decisions. So, of course, let's call them the opponents of democracy are working with these decisions. But that doesn't mean that these micro-decisions are in themselves undemocratic. But that's, I think, the struggle that's happening at the moment.
Hello, I have a question for Florian, and I apologize if it's perhaps slightly tangential. And it's around the distinction, I'm getting an echo, but the distinction between the micro-decision and the split second. And I was having a conversation with my colleague last week, and we were talking about legally, the split second has been used as a very commonly invoked legal defense. I did not have time to decide or make a decision, I just had to act. And we see that time and time again as the kind of legal alibi for, in particular, say, acts of kind of racist violence, et cetera. And I guess so what we have legally is a negation of a temporal space in which a decision is actually possible. And so I suppose I'm wondering how that might migrate or translate to the domain of the micro-decision, that's where the temporal gap is what allows a certain outcome to emerge. And so just sort of thinking about what the different legal implications might be vis-a-vis the ways in which the notion of the split second has been mobilized within contemporary legal discourse and trials, et cetera.
Well, thank you. I think the point about micro-decisions is their quantity and the speed with which they are happening. And of course, this question of a split second or interruption is important for this concept, but it also goes way beyond it. For example, in psychoanalytics, it's important that you do things that you don't know that you are doing them, and that you're doing them in this kind of interval or split second. So, of course, the split second is central to this problem, and in this sense, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, you have to put your hand up higher so we can
This is a question about the extent to which we need a new language for decision making or a new way of talking about it. Because a lot of the things that you're talking about in relation to machinic decision making seem as if they could just be underlining a paradox, or if you want to put it in Derridian terms, an aporia within decision making itself between the calculable and the incalculable. And so, you know, decision, if it were, a decision wouldn't be a decision if it were actually calculable. You could just run the calculation, you wouldn't need to make a decision. On the other hand, every decision has to be calculated. So I wonder if what we're actually confronting in machinic decision making is a kind of uncanny version of decision making itself. It's reminding us of this kind of strange impossibility at the heart of decision.
Yeah, so I agree with your point. I think that when we see them see this kind of aporia that you mentioned, then this aporia, also in the Derridian sense, can be seen as a symptom. And I think as a symptom that, of course, there's this dimension of calculation in these decisions, that they have been programmed and that they are based on algorithms or protocols. But they also have this moment of interruption in which something else happens, something that cannot be described only by saying that it's calculated or that it's technological. And of course, that this dimension is in a way the moment when the social and the technical come together, and where you cannot divide the social and the technical.
There's somebody right here in the front who's been trying and trying.
Yeah, it also concerns the fact of jurisdictional responsibility in micro decisions, and my question is that if I understand you correctly, you described it as a negotiation process from different players, let's say a car manufacturing company on the one hand and jurisdictional law writers on the other hand. And then my question is that in this decision-making progress, how important are those interests? Because I can frame a scenario, let's say a case, where you have a car which has to decide if I stop the car, or if I like save my own driver, or if I go into a group of like passengers or so. So, and then is this a question of a decision or of the calculations which are implied in this interruption?
I think what you're describing is the situation in which where the oppositions of the decision are negotiated. So people are discussing, the car makers are discussing which situations can we imagine for the car in which it has to react. But I think the moment of micro decision is not similar, or is not the same, because it is the moment in which the car has to decide between these oppositions. These oppositions were discussed, and they are products of negotiation processes, which all actors are human in a certain sense. And the machinic agency is happening in this short interval of time on a different layer.
My question is for Patricia. I'm curious about, sorry, I'm down here. The aliens, I want to know more about the alien subjectification and like this quote. I'm going to quote you on how to become better prey to the outside. And I want to know, like, is that to become like fatter, more juicy data subjects? And if so, is that an accelerationist line of thinking? And then my second question is, who or what is the outside? Just to get a bit more kind of.
Yeah, I mean, this concept, I mean, just to be fair in terms of attribution, this idea of like becoming prey to the outside, this is like directly lifted from Negarestani's Cyclonopedia, like there's sections in this. So this, just to be clear on the accreditation of the concept. I think the thing that I'm most interested in, and maybe it's problematic, is to kind of, probably because of my, ignorance in media theory, I'm not as involved in specifically media studies as a lot of the other people here, but to like really, to just kind of have this extreme doubt, even as somebody who is supportive of and realizes that we need to, that technology is going to be a huge factor in shaping if we're going to have a future or not. If we can't change the way that we see the world, we're just going to keep continuing to make technology in this kind of deeply flawed self-image, I think. And so which is arguably a little bit more abstract, because I think, and that's why I'm kind of interested in this idea of, like, let's say, cognitive contamination in a sense. Basically, we have to change how we understand ourselves, how we understand what constitutes, like, really basic political questions, that are not even anything to do with technology. How we understand who is the we of the political body, who composes it, what composes it, all of these things that are being that the definition of that is, like, deeply challenging the definition of how we understand what humans are. If that really seeps in and really affects us, this kind of, and what I mean by the outside is not it's more just like a foreign idea, right? That I operate right now, where I, generally feel that this is my border condition, I have a skin and I'm an individual and so on and so on. But this is, of course, very much conditioned on being, a child of neoliberalism. And if those self-transformations can occur, what other possibilities for intervening in the world arise as a result of that? So although it is extremely non-concrete, I still think it's a really important step to address in order to even begin to have discussions about how a new political structure could emerge. What would that be? How would it look like? How would justice work? How would responsibility work? How would all of those things work if we're still, developing it from the perspective of a deeply flawed world image? So the concept with the alien subjectivation is mainly, there's a lot more elaboration that has, kind of like geometric derivatives, but it's essentially about the ability to become foreign to oneself, in a sense. And so that's basically what it is. So in this way, it's a kind of productive mode of alienation. Yeah, alienation here isn't negative. It's a way that you become dislodged from the familiar.
And we're not there yet. I'm just curious if, because it sort of seems like a really broad concept, right? And so, in some level, we're there already. Like, we're already alien from ourselves. Is that sort of what you're suggesting, or we need to become? This is something we're not yet at.
There's like many levels. I think there's many levels it could happen at. I think one of the interesting things, and I'm just in the middle of a book now from Tristan Garcia, that is new, so we in French, it's not translated yet, but I can't give you the conclusion, but the interesting thing about it is that basically he kind of charts this kind of telos of human development is this kind of increasing expansion of what the groups are, right? So we start from a very small thing, we're going out, and now we get to the borders of just humanity as such, for example. But I think that even if we say we in this extremely vast sense, that could even eventually start to include other non-human actors. For that to have political import and weight, then it can't just be an arbitrary category, right? It can't just be an arbitrary enclosure like, oh, we're all humans. No, that's not politically actionable, but it has to have some more fundamental meaning. And so to me, that would require a step of alienation in order to achieve a kind of more robust enclosure of that is expansive.
There's somebody up there. And then I think this will have to be our last one. We're already out of time, and there's one last question up there.
Okay, I keep it short, I promise. My question is mainly addressing the wonderful talk of Brett. I'm posing the question what the machine or what the computer is for us, because you said finance is about writing contracts about the future, and and then you pose the question, what can you automate about this? And for me, seeing the computer also as a bureaucratic machine, I think in finance one of the most automated things is administrating those contracts and making them accountable. And this automation process you rather described as a smooth process. And I just wanted to bring together the talk of Florian and your talk, and ask you, can you tell us more about the ruptures and interruptions of this of the establishment of this automation process?
So just clarify that, the ruptures in the automation process.
Exactly. So this automation is a process that is already going on since since a long time, since 50, 60 years, and it wasn't just a smooth process of automating these decisions and this automation of contracts. And I think these interruptions in the in this process are very interesting points, and I just wanted to ask you.
Well, I mean, there are some things you just can't automate in finance. I mean, we were talking about this, I think somebody mentioned this thing about decision making. I mean, some decisions in finance are just inherently, you just don't know the answer. So it's more like an art form than some kind of thing that you've got a distinct outcome that you can program and then optimize. And actually, especially in high finance and in forms of complex finance around like large-scale uncertain projects, it's almost impossible to automate them. The most easily automatable stuff is very small-scale finance with low-value customers, which is basically you guys or us. That's what is most subject, because it's also subject to statistics. Okay, so you can basically build models that where you can. In the way that the large-scale financial project, when you operate in the level of billions, you can't. There's too few instances to actually be able to use statistics to model them. The other big jamming point in automation is regulation of finance. This actually stops a lot of automation processes. Actually, if we look at one of the reasons why, for example, in the US, it's got such a fragmented payment system compared to, for example, Netherlands or Sweden and those kind of places, is that there's basically regulatory structures that stop them fully automating those systems, and basically, so you actually have a lot of these types of inefficiencies that emerge. Just like a little aside about, actually I don't have time for a side, do I? Maybe make one last point. One of the current narratives which you'll start to hear pushed out a lot is this idea of the inevitable coming of a cashless society, which is actually more accurately referred to as a bank payment society. And this, it draws on a lot of this idea of some kind of smooth, almost natural kind of like law via which automation will take place. As if somehow it just occurred by some sort of natural progress concept. But of course, there are actually distinct political interests behind pushing that, particularly the banks, payments companies, and certain governments. And that's actually an interesting moment to think about whether there will be political resistance to that automation process. I mean, you don't have to describe it as automation, but basically a digitization process. I mean, it's entirely plausible that you will actually stop that through political resistance. Now, that'll be a disjuncture in the system. If you want to talk further about it, I can elaborate.
It's also a nice note to end on, so we'll end here. Thank you.